Hello, everybody. Welcome to the WAPPP webinar on understanding the outlook of airport PPPs in the US. My name is Jacques Follin. I'm member of the steering committee and chairman of the airport chapter of WAPPP. Well, I just want to share with you some webinar technicalities and present the sequence of events for the next 90 minutes. First point, the duration of the webinar will be 90 minutes. It will be recorded and it's scheduled to finish by 7 p.m. Geneva time and 1 p.m. Washington time. We will make a recording available of this webinar on the WAPPP YouTube channel, and you will receive by mail the link to the YouTube channel. The chat functions will be activated for organizational matters only. Please, if you have any question, use the Q&A box for any queries you may have. We will answer the question at the end of the roundtable. In terms of sequence of events, after a short presentation of the panelists and a business introduction made by Modalist or partner, each panelist will answer the questions will be made by David Baxter, and the roundtable will last around 60 minutes, and then you can ask your question through the Q&A mechanism which is given with WAPPP. So, well, thank you very much. And now let me give the floor to David Baxter, who is the chairman of the North American chapter. Thank you very much. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacques. Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to participate, and I'm glad that you could be here today. Today, we're going to be talking about the aviation, or the status of aviation PPPs in North America. Just a little bit about my background. Apart from being the chair of the North American chapter of WAPPP, I'm also a senior PPP consultant with the International Sustainable and Resilience Center, and an independent consultant that works on PPPs all over the world. As my wife says, you live, eat, sleep, dream, talk, walk, anything PPPs, and I thoroughly enjoy them. We're going to look at PPPs from an aviation perspective in North America. And even though this is a North American perspective, I believe that what we're talking about will also be of relevance to people who are calling in from other parts of the world. There's a very high airport activity in the world on average when it regards PPPs. And one of the things that's really interesting is the United States has an extremely active aviation sector because of the size of the country. And North American, for some weird reason though, the North American airport sector has very low participation by the private sector. It tends to be more run by authorities and government institutions. The federal government, for example, has also been heavily involved in trying to promote aviation and improving the infrastructure, but still limited, interest from the private sector. We are seeing that the North American market is showing some positive signs for PPP activities, specifically also, for example, in the New York area, where there seems to be of great interest. The models that are also being looked at are, under review. As I always say, every specific project has its need for its own specific model. But in general, we're looking generally at the whole range of DBFOM. For those who do not know what that means, design, build, finance, operate, and maintenance. So every PPP model is essentially an iteration of that combination. And we're going to look at, what is happening, what are the barriers, what should we be expecting with changes that are happening, and what could be the measures that can promote this sector. We will go through a process of answering questions by the panelists, and I just want to take this opportunity to briefly introduce the panelists as well. The first, and in no specific order, just the way that I was presented with the list. The first is Amit Ricky, who is the founding chief executive of Carlisle Airport Group. He's been leading PPPs for P3s for project renovation expansion of the JFK Terminal 1. He's always been involved for over 25 years, and he's been involved in approximately 50 airport P3 transactions globally. He was also directly involved in key US P3 activities. The second person that I want to introduce is Dr. Morteza Farajian, who is the senior executive leading the Build America Bureau at the United States Department of Transportation. And he's responsible for credit programs and loan guarantees with 29 billion in existing portfolio and more than 22 billion allocated, issued or pending in the private activity bonds that support the development of large scale and intermodal transportation infrastructure. The Bureau is also promoting innovative project finance solutions, which help states and local governments develop and finance P3s. Prior to this role, he was also the Deputy Secretary of Transportation and Director of the P3 unit in Virginia. And he is also an entrepreneur who's co-founded a crowd financing platform that promotes local and small investors. I'd like to also introduce David Olivier Taras, who's been working for more than 20 years in the infrastructure industry and has implemented a significant number of complex structured M&A and P3 transactions in the world, including in the US. Until the end of 2021, he was the managing director of the ADP International Americas based in New York, and he was in charge of overseeing Group ADP's development in the Americas, including the recent investment in the operation of Stewart Airport. Prior to joining Group ADP, he also worked as a strategic consulting industry expert at the Boston Consulting Group. Then we have Frank Screeman, who is an executive with Advantage Airport Group, a leading international airport investment, development, and management company, serving 58 million annual passengers and 160 airlines across a network of 10 airports in 5 countries. He's currently Chief Executive Officer of the LaGuardia Gateway Partners, LGP, the private company that was selected by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey to manage and redevelop LaGuardia's Airport Terminal B. He has 20 years of experience in senior leadership and management experience, and is actively involved in all aspects of airport management, including airside and groundside operations, emergency response, commercial and business development, and capital planning and construction. We have also Steve Somersis, who is currently the Managing Director of Transportation Infrastructure, Investment and Banking at the Citigroup. As such, Stephen is involved in the financing of most of the airports in the United States and in the region where financing is done by local authorities through P3 mechanisms. I'd also like to introduce Jorge Roberts, CEO of Avports, which is America's most experienced airport operator and present manager of more than 10 airport platforms in the United States. Avports is owned by the West Street Infrastructure Partners III, a family of infrastructure investment funds managed by the merchant banking division of the Goldman Sachs Group. His airport manager and P3 investment experience and career spans over 14 years. I then basically would also like to introduce briefly Mr. Curtis Grad, who is the CEO of our partner Medallis Airport. And he's going to make a quick presentation on the airport industry, if we can call it that, in North America. So Curtis, the floor is yours. I hand over to you. And once we have finished with that session, we will enter into the structured discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. I appreciate the introduction. And the panelists certainly will bring a lot of discussion to the table. I'm really just here to start the conversation, do a bit of a recap on what we have seen in the North American market. I'm going to cover Canada, the US, and Mexico, but the primary conversation after that will be focused on the US. So assuming everybody can see the screen, I will start with talking a little bit about the participation of PPPs and private sector around the globe. And not a big surprise that Europe is by far the strongest market when it comes to private sector participation in airports, followed by Latin America, then Asia, followed by the Middle East. And surprisingly, we're starting to see more activity in the private sector investment in Africa. But as David has alluded to, when I call the number for North America, that excludes Mexico. But for Canada and the US, we're looking at roughly 1% of airports that have some sort of private or private sector participation in airports. So with that as a context, I thought I'd take a quick run through what's happening in Canada or what's been established in Canada. There's Billy Bishop Airport, which is JP Morgan, operated by Newport. It is a P3. Iqaluit is up in the north, above the 60th parallel. And in fact, that involves Bouygues and Winnipeg Airport. It's structured as a PFI. Vantage has been obviously involved in a number of airports throughout Canada over the years, including the 4 we see listed here. They're a mix of O&M and P3s, and I'm sure Frank will elaborate on that a little bit later. There are a few smaller one-offs. Elevate Airports is a privately operated airport with Cranbrook, and you've got Boundary Bay Airport is again a smaller airport that is operated under a management agreement, and there's a few others. We've got a few unique ones as well. We have a large seaplane base in the harbor of Vancouver, probably outside of Maldives. It's the largest float plane operation, but it is privately owned and operated, with airlines operating there on a common use basis. And somewhat smaller and a slightly different model, you've got Harbor Seaplanes, Harbor Air Seaplanes operating a private or a public facility, but owned by the airline in Victoria. In process, there's been some discussion the last year and a half regarding some land lease opportunity at Billy Bishop. It's effectively in limbo, mostly due to uncertainties around the pandemic, but that is technically still on the table. And a smaller airport in Newfoundland is going through a process of a final close, but again, a very small airport. The potential pipeline in Canada, there was a trial balloon floated back in 2015 by the federal government. It was quickly burst. There's some discussion that it may resurface in the future as the government tries to figure out how to pay for a lot of the COVID relief over the last 2 years. So that's Canada. Very quickly now, walking through the US situation. We're all well aware of Puerto Rico, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that a little bit more. We've got New York, certainly well represented with LaGuardia, JFK, both Terminals B and LaGuardia, Terminals 6 and 1 in New York. And again, with the panelists on, I won't spend too much time talking about that, because I'm sure they'll have plenty to talk about. We've got Newark, Terminal A under an O&M, a very unique one being Cross-Border Express in Tijuana, or in San Diego, bridging over to Tijuana Airport. Payne Field, again, a bit of a novel approach, but that airport is, or that terminal is a private terminal. Austin South Terminal, and as David mentioned earlier, over 10 airports with outports. And then you've got Vinci, when they acquired Airports Worldwide and TBI a few years back, they hold currently 5 airports in the US. There's a few that are in various stages of development, and that includes 9 small airports in Puerto Rico. Gulf Shores is in process, Northern Colorado Passenger Terminal, Bluegrass Station in Kentucky, and Wilmington, all in early stages, so not really determined exactly what the structure is. And then we've had a few notable casualties over the years, Chicago, Denver, St. Louis. I'm sure we'll be talking about that. And then some smaller ones being Punta Gorda, Westchester. And Jorge reminded me that there was an attempt back in early 2000s for Stewart, which then was restructured and became a success story, but that wasn't without its difficulties in the beginning. Potential pipeline, there's been talk about Chicago Suburban Airport for years. I would categorize that as being in limbo as well. And there was a little bit of talk about Anchorage International Terminal about a year and a half ago. And again, I would categorize that as being in limbo as well. Finally, and very quickly, we're all well aware of the 3 major concessions in Mexico, and covering, well over 20 airports in that group of 3. The one item that is coming up, or has come up since, is the Toluca Airport, and that is outside of that cluster of 3 major concessions. And there is some talk about Santa Lucia. We're involved there currently on the ORAT, but it is being developed and operated by the military. There's been some discussion of what it might look like afterwards. And then Cancun, Tulum, it's a little earlier in the process, but again, some discussion about what may or may not happen there in terms of private sector involvement. So, gentlemen and audience, that's a very quick rundown of the situation in North America. A bit more information can be provided on airportir.com, so take a look at that. If you would like a copy of this presentation, either email us at this email address, or you can just drop your email address into the chat box. We'll pick that up and send it to you straight away. So David, that's the quick rundown, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Curtis, for sharing that information with us and setting the background for our discussion. I'll just wait until you disengage your screen so that we can, there we are. Thank you. So we have a series of questions divided into sort of categories of questions. And the first category that I'm going to be asking are questions on the existing portfolios of airport PPPs in the US, what's happening currently. And that's a good, segue from what Curtis has shared with us. These questions I am directing at the panelists. We will give you an opportunity later on, the people who have tuned in for this webinar. We'll be looking at your questions, and we'll give you a chance after this session to floor your questions and to provide specific answers. The first question that I would like to ask some of the panelists is, that airport PPPs have been developed in the US mostly in the New York, New Jersey area. And then the question is, and we hear about these events happening, and what we want to know is, how successful are these transactions so far? And what makes the New Jersey, New York area so specific in the matters of airport PPPs? I'm going to direct the question first at Amit, if you could provide us with some insights in this regard, and then I will ask some of the other panelists, or give them an opportunity to answer this question as well. So Amit, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Glad to have you join us. So the question on New York is pretty interesting because, as you know, New York is the largest aviation market in the United States, so the New York, New Jersey area, with the three main airports, but also, a range of other smaller airports that you mentioned, Stewart, Republic, others that are in the New York, New Jersey area, probably a collection of 6 airports, but the 3 big ones being JFK, Newark, and LaGuardia. What's interesting is that the Port Authority is the operator of these airports through various lease structures that they have with either the city of New York or with the state of New Jersey. The Port Authority is a bi-state agency that is controlled by the state of New York and the state of New Jersey. The structure of the Port Authority and the structure of the airports themselves make them quite unique in the United States to be able to look at bringing in private participation and entering into public-private partnerships on discrete assets. So let's take JFK, for example. JFK has a number of unit terminals in the JFK campus. So the Port Authority can look at entering into private participation, public-private partnerships, and has a long history of doing so, dating back to the early 1990s, and looking at how those discrete terminals are operated through either a collection of airlines, which is in the case of Terminal 1, existing Terminal 1 at JFK, which is a lease with a group of 4 airlines, with Terminal 4, the existing Terminal 4 that was developed as an international terminal originally at JFK, that is currently operated by Schiphol, and the new PPPs that are being that are going on currently at JFK. Obviously the new Terminal 1, which is with financial sponsors, the Carlyle Group, JLC Infrastructure, and Ullico, and then the Terminal 6, which is Vantage and JetBlue partnering on that along with other investors. So that makes it quite interesting, given their the profile of the Port Authority, given the profile of the airport, that they're discrete structures. They've had a history of having private participation in individual unit terminals. The same is true at Newark, where there are unit terminals that the Port Authority can then look to either bring in private participation. So even Terminal A, Jorge's company, Airports, was the predecessor operator of Terminal A. Terminal A is being, a new Terminal A is being built, which is being built by the Port Authority. It's not under a P3, but Munich has been now brought in as an operator. So continuing that outsourcing of O&M for Terminal A. But there was, more interestingly, a P3 that was entered into in a contract, a consolidated car rental facility at Newark Airport. So, not a terminal building, but essentially an airport asset, a discrete airport asset that entered into a P3. And then LaGuardia, again, where, Frank can talk a lot more about LaGuardia, but again, LaGuardia is made up of discrete terminals. Frank has been directly involved in the LaGuardia project, and I'm sure he can talk more about that.
Thank you very much. Frank, this is your opportunity.
Sure. Thank you, David, and good morning / close to afternoon, everyone. A pleasure for Vantage and myself to be here today. Maybe I'll start with two-part question in terms of how successful, and then what's maybe different about New York. Maybe I'll start with the successful piece, given from LaGuardia Terminal B's perspective, we're probably obviously furthest along in terms of development of a PPP project in the New York area. And I think certainly Vantage and the rest of our shareholders, Skanska, Meridian, and JLC, would argue the redevelopment, the PPP, has been extremely successful. In LaGuardia, if we look at overall a $5.1 billion redevelopment program, we're about 95% complete at this point in time. We're on track and on schedule to finish on schedule and on budget. We've driven, just from an operational perspective, we've driven our net promoter score that we measure from our passengers from a -50 when we started to a +59. We won numerous awards, most recently the Prix Versailles Award for Airport Architecture, and I think we've been able to do all this in partnership with the Port Authority, the airlines, the local communities, and everyone else who I think end up with an asset that certainly the entire program is very proud of. So from a success perspective, I think overall we've been able to certainly achieve our objectives. In terms of what's different in the New York area, I'm not sure there's any sort of magic in New York that makes a PPP successful. I do think, to Amit's point, certainly strong history and ability to do so here. I do think one of the pieces, though, was also sort of the burning platform that was here, and I think everybody recalls the comments from former Vice President, now President Joe Biden, around you bring somebody to LaGuardia, put them in a blindfold, and they'll think they're in a third world country. I think that ignited political will to really drive change, and certainly in LaGuardia, and now I think that's extending on to the other airport assets across both LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. So I think the political support, the burning platform, is one key piece that has to be there to bring all of the elements together and really drive the program forward. I think the other piece that certainly I think played to success of the program here was in terms of how the Port Authority set up the procurement. They really allowed for not just the financing element of the PPP to come into play, but also the innovation and the public sector, private sector expertise that Vantage and other private sector partners were able to bring. I think they created an element that allowed that to come to fruition through the procurement program. So they utilized, at the time, a collaborative meeting process and what they called an alternate concept process, where we could meet through the procurement process and talk about potential innovations and potential thoughts, and they would either give you sort of green light, red light. And it's really through that process that ultimately the design that we have here came to be in LaGuardia, and we took what was originally the referential design that the Port Authority had given us to bid on, and really transformed that, I think, into what we have today: lessened risk, lessened phasing, allowed more certainty around construction timelines and cost certainty. and really ultimately allowed us to finance the entire program. So I think that was also a key piece, just in terms of the procurement, how the procurement was set up, and allowing that private sector expertise to factor in.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, that's frankly a really good point. And just to emphasize, the political will across the New York, New Jersey area is, perhaps paramount to ensure the success of these projects and the number of projects that we've seen in the New York, New Jersey area. I mean, not only is sort of New York, New Jersey, the gateway into the United States, or considered to be the gateway into the United States. I mean, JFK by far is the largest international airport in terms of international passengers arriving into the United States. The political will, driven by both governors of New York and New Jersey, and then that will being translated by the leadership of the Port Authority, has been extremely important. And one of the things that we've noticed, so JFK Terminal 1 will be the largest P3 for an aviation project that's ever been undertaken in the United States. $9.5 billion, all of it privately financed. It is, the partnership that we've entered into with the Port Authority, the allocation of risk, the enabling works that are required to undertake a project of this nature, the community involvement, it has been absolutely critical in ensuring that these projects come to life and eventually are delivered successfully.
Thank you. I have noticed that people are starting to send questions through the chat function instead of the question and answer function. We'll be monitoring the question and answer window. So please direct your questions there and not through the chat function. Briefly, David, Olivier, do you have any comments also to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to. I'm really pleased that you have me. I would just add one element to what Amit has just said. I think what is really striking is the sophistication of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They're really using P3s, the essence of P3s, which is all about managing risk and allocating risk to the best parties. And I think they have been very, very clever in adapting a scheme to specific situations and to solve really specific problems in each cases. So the solution they have adopted in LaGuardia Central Midfield Terminal is obviously very different than what the structure that you see at JFK or that you see at Newark or at Stewart Airport. So I think they are really using this P3 scheme as first a tool to manage risk and manage the delivery risk on projects which are obviously of a very, very large order of magnitude, but also to import and get the input of the best expertise, the best that the private sector has to offer in terms of experience and in terms of quality of service, in terms of innovation, in terms of also capacity to develop traffic as well. And so I think what the port has achieved here is really a fantastic case study.
Thank you very much. So we've talked about some of the successes and why the New York, New Jersey area is so successful. I just would like to ask another question is, it says that we found out that most of the FAA programs are difficult to implement or have not been successful. Are there any specific reasons behind this that the panelists are aware of? And I'm going to ask David, Olivier to answer that first, just so that you can do a bit of a carryover through the previous comments.
So it's an interesting question because we, as an airport, a very global airport operators, we are exposed to many regions, Europe, LATAM, and it's through the US has been lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of P3. I think one of the reasons is the very significant decentralization of infrastructure management. As you know, airports in the US are managed by local authorities, municipalities, local airport authorities. And we used to say that when you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3 in the US. So the cost to reach, the cost to market a P3 is very significant. It's a significant endeavor for any private investor. So that's the first comment I would make. The second comment, especially on the recent failed attempts on P3 like St. Louis and so on, the level of local political risk has been extremely high. And I'm not sure that on all these failed process, the alignment of local stakeholders has been optimal in all cases. And there is really an inherent risk with managing processes with local authorities. Before we jump into a project, we really want to make sure that there's a good level of commitment from the local authorities to the process, and that the preliminary work has been done in terms of local politics, in terms of associating the population and so on. The third comment I would make is a peculiarity in the US, which is the very, very deep access that municipalities have on the municipal bond market. And that creates a kind of illusion that they have access to very cheap funding. And very often we face a conversation in which local authorities object to the private sector that why would we pay 15% return on an investment when we can actually borrow virtually with unlimited capacity. We can borrow on the market at very, very cheap conditions. I think the issue is they forget sometimes that the risk of execution is not factored into this reasoning, and the risk of owning an asset which may become obsolete. I mean, the strategic risk of owning an asset that may run obsolete. I mean, your car parks might not be used when Uber will be prevalent, or when self-driven cars will be prevalent, or because you face as an airport a massive dehubbing because an airline just collapsed, and it happened in the past, like in St. Louis case. I think they don't factor this risk, this strategic risk of owning an asset which may depreciate over time. And I think that this really biases the perception about the relative economics of a P3 related to funding, an asset with bond issuance on the muni bond market.
Thank you. Jorge, we haven't heard from you yet. Any words of wisdom that you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I think that really hit a lot of them on the head. I think the biggest issue we're facing is that whenever there's a failed process or incomplete process, it just sets everything back, especially gives ammunition to those who oppose, P3s from a principal point of view. But it's also, there's a loss of control that is feared by the public authorities, and a lot of it is just more a lack of education and misinformation. And I just feel that the industry or others, we haven't done the best job there. And also we're heading other headwinds where that David Olivier kind of explained, whether it's distortions on the financing or perception too that, hey, I run this airport, it's in good shape. I get good feedback from airlines. Having passengers, it's growing. Why would I rock the boat, right? And especially putting in risk political capital from a politician or even from an airport manager to even bring this up. And I've heard from the various airport managers, even recently, that even uttering the word P3 could potentially, mean that you're asked to, exit through the door, or it's we call like a third rail, right? So I think that what we need to do is continue to build kind of the success stories, and I think either you have either a political entity that is willing or has made a decision to outsource and or doing P3s like the Port Authority, and that is large enough to insulate itself from political risk, or you have to have a strong political champion, similar to the one we've seen in our project in New Haven, where we have kind of the backing of the governor and the senators and the mayors. But that's done through like a lot of hard work, and that's because that's been done kind of in a sole source deal. I think in a public procurement, you're opening yourself up to all kinds of scrutiny and discussion, and it's a little bit harder to guide the right information and really kind of at least counter a lot of the naysayers. Or a lot of the people that have other interests, and that sometimes includes the specific airlines as well. And so in the past, there's been privatization or allocation of leases to airlines, but and people seem to be okay. And let's not forget that also airports are doing P3s and all kinds of assets, cargo facilities, MROs, DSC equipment, all kinds of things in property management. But when it comes to passenger terminal, it's not the case. And I think that's because the airport managers want to kind of continue to maintain some perception of, some control. And I think that it's a lot of it, lack of education and just lack of precedent. And until we don't have more precedents that are successful, then it's going to be very challenging for a whole airport lease to come through, in my opinion.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. And this is very
David,
similar to this, where I'll give you a chance, Amit, to answer this question. It's very similar. We've talked about, what are the general reasons, but the US also has a legacy of unsuccessful terminals or airport privatization projects. And do you see this reality legacy as a barrier for future projects? It's a very similar question. So Amit, if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, thanks, David. And I agree with everything that Olivier and Jorge said. I just wanted to highlight, in the context of answering the specific question, in the US, it's not about capital, and David covered that. It is airports. We have to remember that in the US, airports are controlled locally. Airports are the most visible of assets and the most emotive of assets for any community. It is the gateway to that community. And for a mayor or a city manager or city council or an airport authority to make a decision to privatize an airport, whether it's a terminal or the entire airport, is a highly, highly political decision. And so the rationale for doing that has to be completely clear and has to be communicated from the political level, has to be communicated, throughout the entire political machine, but also to the local public. And I think that's where things have fallen short. Why is it that these airports need to be privatized, right? Why is it that somebody else should come in and operate these airports? And what I will tell you is that the biggest, and Jorge touched on this, the biggest fear is not fear, but one of perhaps the biggest reasons is that US airport management, by and far, are very, very professional, is a very professional management group of managers. They're very skilled at what to do. They run very safe, very secure, and in many cases, very, very efficient airport operations. What holds them back are the public procurement regulations that they have to operate under. So when it comes to privatization, when people come in, when privatizing an airport, the fear is that those managers will lose their jobs. And remember, jobs in a community are very, very important. And given how visible an airport is in a community, jobs at an airport are even more important. So that messaging, that balance needs to come through loud and clear. So that perception, the capital, there isn't a real need for capital. David covered that. The political reasoning and the political championing of a project is very key. And then finally, stakeholders need to get the stakeholders on board early. which are all of the communities around an airport, all of the, other beneficiaries, whether they are, service providers, whether they are contractors, they need to be on board. So it's a massive undertaking. It's an undertaking that takes a very long time. And given the political cycles in the US, a lot of times, unless, you've been an incumbent mayor or city manager that's been there for many years and have been able to survive, a number of political cycles, most politicians won't undertake that process because, the political cycle is such that the time just runs out to be able to undertake a process like this. Now, coming back to your question as to whether terminals and other projects will be successful and what the failure of those projects will impact future decisions. I mean, I think it does to a certain extent, but also it doesn't. It does because, they'll say, look, people tried it, didn't work. We don't want to go through that process again. But to a large extent, I think political leaders, airport managers are very savvy, and they understand what it takes to run, why they should look to bring private sector participation in. The time takes a long time, and unless there's a real compelling reason, and that compelling reason could be allocation of risk in a major construction project, very similar to what the Port Authority has done. That reason could be bringing in innovation. That reason could be, help with air service development. It could be a number of reasons, unless there are compelling reasons that really show why a privatization or a P3 might be beneficial. I think the US airport community will probably resist and will not be actively seeking to privatize.
I would just like to make a comment. I think we need to be very clear from an emotive perspective that we don't confuse the terms privatization with PPPs. As soon as you take the public sector out of it and you've privatized it, in my opinion, it's not a PPP anymore. So part of the discussion and the comment that we have with stakeholders and communities should be making very clear distinctions that you might be privatizing services or activities, but it's not like the city is losing the airport that used to be its property.
No. And
you're
David,
absolutely right.
I add a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think indeed a privatization. I mean, most of what we called internally privatization is actually leases, very long-term leases, and there is no such thing as municipalities are on a fire and forget mode. When you enter into a lease, you have a series of control that the authority will actually implement. They will ask you monitoring. So there's a lot of covenants you have in leases, in P3 structures, through which, in fact, the private sector and the local authority are in a very, very tight partnership. And as a private investor, caring about a long-lasting, secure, sustainable development of an airport, we have to involve the local communities. We have to discuss every day with the local authority, because this is a matter of survival, a matter of success for our project. So I think a lot of the resistance we are observing is really around the fact that some municipalities think that they may relinquish control, which actually in real cases is not the case, because there are so many safeguards in the PPP agreements and the leases that, in fact, it's more, how do you establish a strong partnership? And that's
You're right, David, but it has to start at the top, right? And it has to start at the top. But I do think examples like LaGuardia, what Frank is delivering at LaGuardia, examples like JFK, when you have these beautiful, shiny, new, modern, world-class terminals that we haven't had in the United States, world-class, since the 1960s, since these original terminals were developed, we haven't had world-class terminals in the United States. Once those world-class terminals are delivered and operated, and they're operating at the at world-class levels, that I think will spur others to look at how to bring in private, to look at public-private partnerships to help deliver large capital projects.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question, and this one is quite of quite interest to everyone is, do you see the role of airlines versus regional administration as a barrier in implementing airport PPPs? So I'm going to ask Jorge first, if you could give us some insights on small regional airports, and then I'm going to ask Frank Screeman if you can give us a perspective on large airports. So Jorge, if you could please take the floor.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think in terms of, talk about the regional airports and the state of it, rather than the historical, I would say that the US is undergoing what Europe did 20, 25 years ago with the rise of the ultra low cost carriers, and COVID has accelerated that. And so where you see Allegiant, Frontier, Spirit growing double digits, and Frontier like doubling their fleet this year. New airlines such as Avelo, which is akin to a Ryanair, or Breeze, also a new airline, and so they're all very focused on these regional airports, and that this is where the pressure is going to come in for a lot of these municipalities or counties or authorities that just don't have the access to the credit, and they need to access to capital, and the second piece is they just not equipped as management to the growth in order to deliver a low CPE, which a lot of these airlines are going to demand close to zero, meaning that you have to be much more aggressive on your non-aeronautical commercial side of it, which historically U.S. airports have lagged behind the rest of the world, and so that's where they're going to have to look at the private sector. Airlines are going to welcome, as long as we can establish good precedents. And I think, for us, if we can make, the New Haven Airport successful, that's where we've come in initially, a partnership with Avelo Airlines, who established their base. And I think that a lot of the other, low cost carriers are looking at that model, because they certainly don't want to be the ones financing the facilities. I think the time of airlines financing facilities is probably long gone, especially the legacies airlines, American, Delta, United, and even Southwest historically have financed a lot of the terminals to fast track and to implement kind of alternative delivery in a quicker mode, but also much more commercially minded to their operations. I think they're gonna be less likely to finance going forward, given their financial condition, which COVID has just kind of increased their issues. So I think in terms of, I'm pretty bullish in terms of how airlines are going to just continue to be putting pressure on a lot of these smaller airports in order to deliver facilities that are cost effective and operations that are going to maintain their CPE at an affordable rate, so that they can actually base their either operations or fly into that airport.
Thank you, Jorge. Frank, is there a different perspective for large airports, or is it a similar story?
No, I don't see it as a barrier, certainly not as a barrier. I think it's really about identifying the right partnerships, kind of recognizing the common goal, common good, and then working together to drive and achieve. I think we can say, certainly from what we've experienced at LaGuardia, at Terminal B, it was, I think up front, it was really about, there was certainly met with a degree of skepticism in terms of our ability to deliver some of the loss of control elements that some of my colleagues have discussed earlier, all those kind of pieces. And it's been a process of, I think, developing that, again, partnership relationship that the PPP doesn't necessarily mean loss of control from an airline perspective, because at the end of the day, from our perspective as a private entity, for Vantage Airport Group, we're looking to use this to the points that Amit and David made earlier. Success of a program like Terminal B drives success of other programs down the road, and the success of our relationship with an airline in Terminal B drives relationships in other locations. And from the private entity's perspective, we ultimately need to have that strong relationship with the airline, because that's what's going to drive business for us in other locations down the road. And so I think that's kind of, the prevalent piece, is it's really about the partnership driving results and driving benefit for both parties. And I think if we're aligned around that, then it certainly doesn't become a barrier.
Thank you. One very important element of PPPs is alternative financing. And I just want to make sure that Mortez and Stephen don't feel like I've left them out. So the next two questions are going to be directed specifically towards you. The first question, and this is about airports and airport PPP financing, is that access to municipal bonds has made municipalities and counties able to develop the airport infrastructure without calling for private sector involvement. And this was alluded to by the previous panelists. Do you confirm, or do you see this situation changing soon? So I'll hand over to Morteza first. If you're ready, please answer that question.
Sure. Thank you, David, for that question. First, let me make a comment about some of the previous conversations. I heard a lot about risk and risk allocation in P3s. While it's really important, and that's one of the main reasons that people should look at P3s, but didn't hear much about opportunities. I have been involved in P3 projects, not in airport industry, but mainly in transportation industry over the last 10, 12 years in US, especially when I was in Virginia. And our approach over there, and by the way, some of you who know, is probably Virginia is the most active state in terms of having P3 projects. Our main approach there was to focus on opportunities and really think about how private entities can step in. Private financing is going to be more expensive. We accepted that, there is no question in that. But really, we wanted to see how much benefits that will bring in at various levels, and design and construction, operation, maintenance in the future, using technology, better managing resources, and to what extent those benefits, those opportunities would offset costs. If it was justified, we would go ahead and do with this P3 project. If not, we always wanted to have alternative options to use our public resources to go ahead and build projects. And going back to your question, I think, again, talking about municipal bonds, to me, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. Authorities should have access to cheap municipal bond to pay for infrastructure projects, because infrastructure is really important. We need to subsidize financing of infrastructure projects. But we should also have opportunities similar to what we're talking about here, P3 opportunities, that to the extent a private company can step in, bring their own capital to the table. And by bringing their capital to the table, as I said earlier, to me, it's going to be more expensive. But now you have a private partner who has a skin in the game, who has financial interest, and there might be other interests as well, to see this project succeed. And they will do whatever they can in terms of utilizing their skill sets, the newest technologies, the newest management approaches to make this project as profitable as possible. And of course, in terms of operation, provide the best operation, because providing better service to the users of that facility means success for the project, win-win situation for everyone. That's where I think where we should focus and how we should sell these projects. I go and talk to different states at various levels, from governors all the way to county officials. And that's how I talk about best practices in P3s. And that's how I try to educate them about the best opportunities that they can have to have P3 as a tool, similar to all other tools that they have, and try to use it for the right reasons, for the good policies that they may have, for the right projects. Then talking about financial assistance that we can provide, similar to municipal bond for localities, authorities who can finance P3 projects at a very cheap rate. We have other options at federal level. For example, we have private activity bonds. Some P3 projects are using private activity bonds that are tax exempt, and somehow it puts them in a similar situation than that the locality is. We also have federal loan programs, and I'll be happy to talk about it in a little bit. That at federal level, we have about $100 billion within the Bureau alone that we can lend to different projects. Airports, we couldn't lend to airports before, But now, based on the new legislation, we can lend pretty much to all different types of projects within the airport, not only terminal, but other types of projects as well. And I'll be happy to talk about it later. I just don't want to take too much time to answer your first question.
Thank you. Stephen, from an industry perspective and from Citibank's approach, can you share with us some of your ideas in that?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with most of the commentary from Morteza. I think for the most part, tax-exempt bonds have provided a long-term fixed rate competitive capital solution for privatizations. But to Morteza's point, I think that there is also a number of examples and continuing examples in the sector where the private sector has used municipal bonds in a competitive way to finance projects, particularly the airlines where, American, United, Delta, JetBlue, among examples of airlines that have used or tapped the tax-exempt market to finance terminal developments. And those terminals are owned by the airport or the municipality and leased on a long-term lease to those airlines. And then we're also seeing instances where private developers are tapping the municipal market to finance terminal developments. And you've already heard about the Terminal B at LaGuardia, as well as all the activity going on around Kennedy Airport. So they're good examples in addition to, Conrax and people movers and so forth. So I think, overall, while municipalities do have access to GARBs, and GARBs are a competitive source of financing for municipalities, the private sector is looking at special facility bonds to finance the similar types of projects. And have successfully done so. So I don't necessarily think it's just the source of financing. I think it's all the other factors that other panelists have mentioned, the value being brought to the table, the risk return, the political factors and stakeholder involvement are all very, very important to these privatizations. I think overall, a private entity can be very helpful and accretive to a public sector airport project. And look, there are many ways for them to access competitive capital, and be it tax exempt or taxable. The typical approach is obviously to assess every market that's available and apply the best financing for the project.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes of opportunity for panelists to answer questions. So I'm going to push forward with the questions. Morteza, you alluded a bit to about, federal financing tools, funding, and you said you would address that later on. So here's your chance. Could you just give us, a sense of, with the new legislation that's been acted, how things change? What are the opportunities? If you could go ahead, I won't say more than that.
Sure. So David, before we couldn't finance airport terminals, there was only a very small universe of airport terminals we could finance, and those were eligible under a TOD program, transit-oriented development. These were airport terminals that had a transit access. But the new legislation has opened up the door now. Any airport project can come to us and we can finance that project. We have very, very attractive tools, about $100 billion, and that's with B, in lending capacity. We can give them loans that are even as long as 75 years after substantial completion of the project, which if it takes them 5 years to build it, we can go 80 years into the future for repayment of the loan. The rates are at treasury rates in the US. It's about 2% now, fixed rate. We can even push back payments up until 5 years after project is operational, which the first payment could be due 10, 15 years in the future, which gives these projects plenty of time to construct the project, have it operational, and pay us back. So these programs are very, very attractive. The real question is why they are not being used as much as they should be used. In other sectors, we see an uptick on the highway side, on the rail side, on the port side, on the transit side. Even we can finance now transit-oriented development in terms of real estate development. But on the airport side, Even though the program is new, we have had a lot of discussions with different airports. Some of the challenges that were mentioned earlier during this call, I see them as the main challenges that we all need to work through them. First one is really educating some of the authorities that are managing these airports about different options that they may have. They have been running these airports for years using the same model, and now switching to a new model. One, that change can create some uncertainty, some risk for them. And two, they may just be afraid of what's going to happen because there are not many good examples out there that they can see and say that, I want that. We haven't started that process. We are trying to educate them. There are multiple organizations that we are working with, but also we are funding what we call regional infrastructure accelerators. These are not necessarily for airports, but these are units that we are creating at different parts of US, and we are giving them grants to specifically enable them to provide expertise, to talk about best practices, to educate people who want to learn about alternative delivery models, alternative financing options. Moving forward, we would actually have a $20 million grant every year that we will have advisors that we are going to hire at the Bureau. And to the extent that there are projects out there, project sponsors out there that have projects that are already operational, but they want to bring private sector on board under an asset concession or asset recycling model, we would provide those advisors to them. We will pay for the fees of those advisors so the advisors can help them directly to put a model together, a procurement package together that would be feasible and practical. So those are the type of things that we are doing at the very earliest stages of project identification, project evaluation, and then procurement to enable project sponsors to better understand how they can take advantage of innovative approaches. Again, it's not just for P3s, it's not just for airports, but in general, these are different P3 transportation projects in US that they can benefit from it. I can see how airport projects can benefit significantly from it because we have so many airport projects out there that would be really good candidate for asset concession, asset recycle. And by the way, also take subordinate level. David, I should add this because we take the subordinate level in financing, meaning other financial instruments can be used with us or in conjunction with us, and they will get paid first, and we will take more risk at a lower level. After everyone else has got paid, we get paid.
Thank you. So Stephen, can you comment on that last comment that Mortez has made?
Yeah, I think, look, I wasn't sure if you're asking more about the 25 billion for airports from the federal financing, but I think, you know, the split for that has been articulated, the 5 billion for FAA type initiatives like air traffic control towers, 15 for direct funding and 5 for terminal modernization. But I think from an industry perspective, where the focus is really just trying to understand the procedure for awarding the funds and you know how that process will work, and that's something still being developed by the FAA and DOT, and I think it's going to be important that that's clearly articulated so that the industry has a better understanding of how they can tap into those funds. You know, there's no doubt that these initiatives will provide a great boost to airports to be able to carry on the improvement work that they'd like to do. But there's also a lot of recognition in the industry that to build airports to world-class standards, you know, the likes of the airports we're seeing at JFK and LaGuardia, it's going to require far in excess of the federal grants. And I think this is where the pools of private capital are going to have to come into play.
Thank you. That's it's always good to know that that the public and the private sector funding and financing could leverage each other to deliver better projects. I was going to ask a question, you know, but Morteza, you touched on it about, you know, the announcement by the US presidency. What has it done? And you've pointed out that it is going to be a booster for the airport PPP industry in the United States. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next question. And that is, airports have numerous services, for example, passenger and cargo facilities, aviation services, airport mobility services, and the list goes on and on. And I was just wondering, are there any specific activities that could be targeted for PPPs or maybe shouldn't be? And I think, Stephen, you touched a little bit on that just in your previous comments. Could you just add, you know, what you think is good for for this process, or which should be avoided?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of airport associated businesses that lend themselves to private sector involvement in some form or another. There's the overarching question again is going to be what all panelists have discussed before. Is there enough upside being brought by the private sector? The political factors, the stakeholder involvement, and also risk allocation, how that all plays out into the equation, and that's going to relate to the size and complexity often of the project. But I think it's also worth noting, picking up from, again, some of the other panelists' comments, is that, the majority of airports today do use the private sector in some form or another. So some of these services are already contracted out, not through PPPs, like it's almost taking a first step. And that's, through operating contracts often. So, some airports have contracted operators to manage their terminal assets. Some examples like Avports and Airports Worldwide were pointed out earlier. Some have contracted folks to manage retail concessions, and examples I would point to there would be, the likes of Unibail and Fraport and OTG. And then often, you're seeing the same case for the car parking businesses, where private operators are being contracted to manage the reservations and the booking of car parks and the collection services. But then going beyond that, there are also instances where, like, I guess the transportation to the airport is being privatized, which was discussed earlier. And there's a large number of general aviation facilities, the FBOs, are all in private, well, a lot of them are in private hands. And over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a ton of activity in that sector. We've got ground cargo facilities. A lot of those are already in private hands. The participants in that sector would be FedEx and UPS and Aeroterm and AFCO, who all build these types of cargo facilities. So to a large extent, the private sector has kind of been moving into the airport space. I think where we're not seeing as much full private involvement is around the terminal development. The other place I think people need to keep an eye on too is private sector involvement as a result of the emergence of these eVTOL companies. eVTOL companies have, oh gosh, in the last 12 to 18 months, they've probably billions of dollars have been poured into that sector. And that's all been focused on the development and certification of the actual aircraft. But those aircraft are going to need hard infrastructure, and the requirements of that infrastructure to come. And I think is a good part for the participants in this sector to play in kind of the ramp up of future infrastructure around that sector.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes before we're going to open the floor to those who are attending this webinar. So I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to briefly give each panelist a 1-minute soundbite or 1.5 minutes maybe, to just tell us what you think the future of airport PPPs are. Are there any specific models, facilities, etc.? So I do ask that you keep your answer very succinct. So I'm going to start again, Stephen, just because you're on the top of my screen in no particular order. Your perspectives.
Look, I think I'd like to think it's positively. I think to Ahmed and also Frank's earlier points, the momentum coming out of New York, I think, is a good demonstration of what PPPs can bring to airport assets. And albeit they're at the terminal level, but building world-class facilities through private sector involvement and demonstrating the results of that is going to go a long way to overall supporting the future of PPPs in the US. But I won't say too much because I know we're limited on time and you've got Q&A and a lot of panelists.
I appreciate that. Frank, your views?
Thank you. I think I echo Stephen's comments. I think I think the future is positive. I think again, a successful project like what we saw at LaGuardia, now what we're seeing in JFK side it's good for Vantage, certainly because we're directly involved here, but it's good for the industry in general. I think because it builds confidence that the model can deliver world-class facilities, world-class operations. and do so in a way that's good for the communities that we're operating in. So I think the future is certainly positive.
Thank you, Frank. Jorge, and you unmute.
Yeah, no, I think just to add to that, as I mentioned, the changes in the airline mix are putting pressure on a lot of the airports. Steve Summers had mentioned about the rise of disruptors like EV tolls, autonomous vehicles, and the rate of that rate of change is something that government is just not adept to adapt, and that's where I think the private partnerships are going to come in, as well as the fiscal pressures that are being put. I think the model that if you mentioned, there's not going to be a one single model. I think it's going to continue to be bespoke or customized, and that's what's going to require the investors that are patient, but they're also investors like us that have been willing to invest in the public, the PR, and the community, kind of building support and stakeholder alignment. And to us, that's kind of the model that we're seeing kind of working out for us.
Thank you very much for mentioning that there isn't one model that fits all, and that we do need a customized or bespoke high efforts. Morteza, you're the next on my screen, so you're up.
Sure, David, I think we all agree that the need is there. The need for modernizing U.S. airport terminals especially is there. I signed a report about a year ago and sent to Congress that was prepared by my team to identify what the gaps are. And for those of you who are interested, you can probably get a copy of it online. And in that report, we actually mentioned that we need to have all the tools available in the toolbox, P3s being one of the tools that we need to have in the toolbox, because it's just really difficult to think about just one way to get this done. We need to have all hands on deck and really work together. And to do that, we need to, one, educate people. We need to make sure that everyone understands about advantages, disadvantages, risks, opportunities. I oftentimes see that people are just pushing for one model versus the other model, but I don't think we should be biased at all. It was mentioned earlier that if we push really hard to get the project done through P3 or any other model, and that project fails, it can just ruin the reputation for the entire market, no matter how many good projects you have had. So we should all also try to make sure that bad projects, or not necessarily bad projects, but projects that are not suitable to be procured as a P3 project are not being procured as a P3 project. And I think if we all do that and create that education as well as support, the future is promising. That's why we work very closely with Congress to have that change so we can actually lend to airport terminals. And these loans, yes, they can help public authorities, but I think there would be a bigger help for private companies, because our rate is the same, whether a public agency is borrowing or whether a private company is borrowing. We give both of them the exact same rate to make things a little bit closer to each other. So I think that would be a boost for P3s in US airport industry. And we are definitely ramping up our efforts within the Bureau. We are hiring a P3 expert. We are working very closely with FAA. I have monthly calls with them. So more to see in that front.
Thank you, Morteza. David, Olivier, 1.5 minutes.
I mean, not much to add after all what my colleagues have just said. I remain rather positive in the sense that the needs are here. We all know that. We were probably not so far away from a few successes that will really catalyze a larger movement. To maybe be a bit more specific, I'm not sure we will see a lot full-blown airport P3s for all the numbers of reasons we have already mentioned, but I tend to see we will see a lot of opportunities on dedicated facilities like cargo facilities, like FBOs, like light rail systems, con-rack facilities, and so on, and possibly terminals. I mean, I think a few examples mentioned earlier by Jorge and so on, because those situations corresponds to a business issues because of the evolution of the airline sector and so on. I think we'll see more and more of these specific P3s around a dedicated infrastructure. And again, I don't think we'll see just one size doesn't fit all. There will be plenty of model. There's a continuum in terms of what a P3 can be, from a pure O&M sort of arrangement to the full-blown P3 where you transfer all the risk to the private sector. So again, I think we'll see a lot diversity in terms of what is the best solution to deliver a project. And I think it's very reassuring when I listen to my colleagues. We are all definitely committed to be in this market for the very long term. We all are long-term investors, and we really want to establish ourselves as sustainable partners for local authorities. And I think it's definitely something which is very positive vis-a-vis the public authorities, to have, you know, partners that are just here to support those fantastic local assets.
Thank you. Amit, just a comment or two from you. You have the floor.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm not going to repeat what everybody said. I think the opportunity is significant. You know, I'm glad that Morteza has a bigger toolkit to put to work. I think that's going to be helpful. We're hoping that your toolkit gets even bigger, Morteza, but you know, it's a good start. And you know, I do think it's going to be bespoke projects. I agree with David Olivier's comment that I don't think it's going to be full airport privatizations. It's going to be bespoke projects. It's going to be, you know, terminals, discrete assets, you know, innovative partnerships. The one thing that I don't think people have mentioned, David mentioned sustainable, but I'll mention sustainability in a different sense. I think sustainability is going to be key. You know, sustainability agenda around airports will require a significant amount of investment that needs to flow into airports to make them more sustainable, to make them more energy resilient. And I think that's an area, again, on a discrete basis, where there's a significant opportunity for public-private partnerships.
Thank you very much. I think this has been an extremely illuminating discussion. You know, people often ask me, what do I learn about PPPs, or what do I know about PPPs? And I say, I always have to learn a lot more. Thank you for this wonderful sharing of insights and knowledge. We have about 15 minutes, and I'm going to go over to the questions that have been coming in the question and answer box. We have 14. We obviously won't get to all of them, so I'm going to do a bit of a pick and choose. And, you know, if you do have questions and you want answers to them, you can always direct them to us, and we can try and get the answers for you from the panelists post this conversation. Oscar Cortez, I know you're very involved with PPPs in Mexico and involved with the, you know, with FEMSEC and the whole state of, you know, what's happening with PPPs in Mexico. Is there anything that, you know, that you think is critically important, you know, to PPPs in Mexico, especially when it comes to the aviation sector? I don't think we can ask that question live, can we, Jacques? You on mute? You're on mute?
Sorry, thank you, David. I've seen a couple of questions on the do you consider that starting with an O&M or developing O&M project would be a good step to introduce the private sector in airports, and could lead then to the developing PPP project in the airport business? We can ask the question to maybe to Jorge, because you're a specialist in O&M, and maybe to Frank, because Vantage has both developed O&M and PPP project. Let's start with Jorge.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for the question. And you know, I think in the case of, it's about developing trust, and that you're going to be a long-term partner. And the way to do that, and we've done that in New Haven, is, you know, we've been there for 22 years under an O&M contract, and that allowed us to be, you know, the partner of choosing, just because we've developed that trust and that alignment over the years. that we're there for the long term and not just going in there to make a profit or developer and leave. I think that's critical, and I think that as some of my colleagues, Olivier and Ahmed, kind of mentioned about being flexible with the opportunities. I think in the O&M side of it, we've seen that historically there's been the cost plus model, but in the case of the contract that we're about to sign in Puerto Rico for the regional airports, there we're taking risk, and there's been allocation of risk to us in terms of a fixed price on the OPEX, and then there's a revenue share for 7 years, and then after that it adjusts. And I think that's a new model, and then those airports then can graduate into a P3 model, because those airports are not suitable for that. So we got to come in very flexible, and that not necessarily works for all financial investors, but for platforms like us who can take can play in the continuum of risk, allows us a lot to provide that flexibility that is needed, that are the panelists have kind of described, and that airport authorities are kind of looking for, whether it's pressure from the disruptors of the autonomous vehicles or the EV tolls, or as Ahmed mentioned, sustainability. The industry is coming into attack on the climate change, and we got to be very aggressive of how can we address that, not just from an actual practical, but also from a perception point of view, and that's going to require a lot of forms of creative innovation in different structures that not necessarily have to related to investment and capital. And so that's going to be a little bit of the departure from maybe what we've seen in other places around the world. And that's where you can inject private sector innovation and then create that trust. And then if there's an opportunity to invest, and then you already are there and have that relationship.
Thank you, Jorge. I have a question here specifically, I think, which is relevant for you, Morteza, and this comes from Matthew Bazanson. He says, will WAPPP consider adopting the flexible schedule mandatory debt service concept for airports, similar to what has been used to manage lanes projects on highways? I hope you understand that question.
Yes, and that's a very, very specific question. We need to look into it. I can give you a straightforward answer, but basically what the concept is similar to what they said earlier, is providing flexibility to project sponsors and borrowers to pay back the loan. Oftentimes we have different payback curves. We give them the flexibility to pay a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on project performance. And to the extent that airport projects need similar flexibility, we are open to that concept, yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Oscar Ponce de Leon asked quite an interesting question. It's a very broad-based question. And that is, so I'm just going to throw to the floor, and hopefully one of the panelists will answer. Do we know of any evidence that PPP airports are more efficient than non-PPP airports? And what should be the most compelling points to make when you're trying to educate public authorities about the benefits of PPP airports? And I saw, Jorge, that you were shaking your head, so maybe that indicates you have a good few words of wisdom for us.
Yeah, no, I think it's you can't really understand until you see it. So one is, a successful project like LaGuardia CTV, something we can point out of the really kind of transformation that's happened there and what's happening at JFK on a larger scale. And then something that, in terms of establishing precedents at the lower, I think that's could be the most compelling arguments, I think, because otherwise the rest is academic. I think, unfortunately, U.S. authorities kind of discount international experience, and they want to see what's the reality, the local reality. It's still kind of very localized, and there's a rise of also nationalistic sentiments as well. So that's some of the headwinds kind of coming in for some of the foreign kind of operators and investors. But I think that also, the efficiencies, in terms of we do it every day. Like the reason that our O&M contracts get renewed is because there's no way of going back really to an in-source model. because of the costs, like are really significant, particularly because, the public authorities are riddled with, the pensions, which, have unfunded liabilities that continue to grow. And then also from a commercial standpoint, like I said, the pressures that these airports are continuing to face from airlines seeking to reduce their CPE, they're going to have to be much more aggressive. And so there's a lot of data already that, a substantial amount of research and precedents around the world, and even in the US that shows that, private sector is more efficient, not just to absorb risk, but to what Morteza said, is to actually create that opportunity and grow. Just not only we have an incentive to grow the traffic and the passengers, but actually to maximize revenues, create an efficient model, but also comply. Because many times we're walking into leases or contracts that there has just been deferred maintenance. There's also been a lack of compliance, and this is all from public authorities because they're not held to their own standards. So it's for the public authority to move from being an operator to being a regulator, because otherwise there's no one else to regulate the public authorities. And the FAA is definitely not doing that. They're doing that for air traffic and Part 139 certifications. Those are all things that airports excel, but they're not looking at, whether it's running efficiently or commercially viable. That's not something the FAA looks at.
Thank you. Amit, do you have comments in that regard?
Yeah, I think Jorge makes some good points. It is about having the right roles. The public authorities regulatory role really important. I'll talk about a couple of things. And I'll talk about JFK specifically. So the JFK, our project at JFK, intended to bring in innovation, but let's talk about sort of during the construction period, what it's doing. It is going to be creating 5,000 construction jobs in the local community. It is going to be creating 10,000 jobs once it's operational, again, in the local community. And you talk about the power that the public-private partnership can bring by creating the jobs, by creating that multiplier effect in the community. I mean, we can talk about, how efficiently the assets run, and that is part and parcel of what we're contractually obligated to deliver to our public sector partner, and to the traveling public and to our airline partners. But it's really all about the impact to the community. And, when we look at projects, when we look at a P3 project, we look at it, where's the intersection of the commercial imperative for the project and the community imperative for, and the community and what the community gains. Because if the community, looking at the community benefits, are sometimes overlooked, and it's so important to ensure to look at those and to ensure that the community benefits from a large project. And it's not just sort of a private sector or a private sector, public sector type of, enclosed loop. So, that's the only thing I'd add to what Jorge said.
One thing that's really interesting that I've heard is a number of times, when we talk about aviation PPPs, this infrastructure is basically gateways to communities. And I think that is really an important takeaway. One thing that is important is sustainability of these facilities. And we need full disclosure on things that are happening, clarity, transparency, etc. And I'm not quite sure who I would ask, but maybe I'll ask David, as Olivier. Can you just tell us, very briefly, because you have 2 minutes, to just tell us some aspects on, the aspect of sustainability. What can we do to make airport PPP infrastructure, facility, services, however you want to describe them, sustainable?
Oh yeah, I mean, there is I think the basics, which is making sure that scope 1 and scope 2 of measures to limit the emissions of our own infrastructures, and this is what we do not only for just philanthropic reasons, but for just business reasons, because it saves money, because we can manage infrastructures more efficiently. So energy savings, energy efficiencies, waste management, and so on. I think where we have a big challenge on the more global climate change issue is around the emission of the entire value chain, and especially airlines, and how to transition from a fossil fuel economy to something else. And that's, I think, where we'll have, as airport operators, the largest challenge. We ourselves at ADP, we've taken the view that we need to be at the forefront of that transition. We have become very recently an LP of a hydrogen fund that is precisely aimed at working with the industry leaders to shape what could be this H2 transition, and what sort of infrastructures are required, what sort of supply chain are required. So that's one aspect, which is obviously the climate change sustainability issue. The second is obviously working with people. We are a very important local actor, and we have to make sure that the development of our activities benefits to the whole community, which has a lot of implications in terms of fostering local employment, fostering insertion of deprived communities, and making sure that they benefit from the activity from a perspective point of view. And so to do that, we have developed over time a lot of tools with public arenas where the local municipalities are and local populations can actually raise questions, raise concerns. So we have established a very, very intense dialogue with local communities to make sure that we are on good grounds with the local population, because it's going to be a precondition for any long-term development of our infrastructures. And there's no massive terminal project today that can't pass through the lens of being green, environmental friendly, benefiting to the local communities and so on. And you need to go through all these filters. So it's a lot of work, but that's a precondition for sustainability.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I feel we could have carried on for another hour with this discussion. Thank you for the very insightful comments and for taking time in your busy schedules to be part of this. I would just make one pitch that as the chairperson of the North American chapter, I'd encourage of WAPP, I encourage you to join WAPP. When you join WAPP, you also join many of the different chapters at the same time. And thank you again, and I'm going to hand over to our esteemed colleague to just close out with some comments on or any insights or closing comments that you have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. I mean, I want to thank the panelists and all the participants to this webinar. I think it's been very interesting. We had a lot of participants, and I'm very happy to see that the airport industry, airport PPP industry in the US is fascinating for a lot of people. Well, I have to close. I want to thank you and to tell you that this video will be available on the WAPP YouTube channel. And I want to tell you all that you can also listen to the last episode of the WAPP Airport Chapter podcast on the WAPP YouTube channel as well. So thank you very much. Thank you all, and hope to see you soon on the WAPP Chapter. Thank you.
Jacques, thank you, David.
Thank you
all my friends.